Well, I don't have that much time, but I've been reading it. I have it here actually. Mm, okay, I got it.
All right, folks, we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. I'm your host, Bill Cannon, and tonight we're going to talk about the Night Stalker case as seen on Netflix. And to talk about that case tonight, I have two of the NYPD's best retired detectives. I have Detective First Grade Michael O'Keefe, who worked for a long time in the squad, did a lot of time in anti-crime up in the 3-4 precinct, so he's used to very busy crime precincts. And I have crowd favorite and YouTube favorite, and one of my favorites, Detective Irma Rivera, first grade detective. She spent 11 years in Manhattan sex crimes, it was called at the time. Now it's called Manhattan Special Victims. And she finished her career in Manhattan South Homicide Squad. So we all watch the Netflix documentary, The Night Stalker, and we're not going to actually critique it. We're just going to talk about it because we felt that this case, the detectives in this case, did an outstanding job. And in any major investigation, one of the most difficult things to do is to make the identification of the perpetrator. And we were looking at this case, which was from 1985. I swore into the NYPD on January 21st, 1985. So that's how long ago this case occurred. And if you know anything about forensic evidence, there was no DNA in 1985. So we look at that case from the eyes of investigators that had and have DNA available to us. But back in 1985, there was no such thing. And even blood evidence was very, it wasn't a high predictable thing because 50% of the population was type O, 25% was AB, and then another 25% was split between the other blood types. So if 50% of an entire population is a certain blood type, it's not going to help you much in getting the perpetrator ID'd. This case, this serial killer, in 5 or 6 months, turned Los Angeles and San Francisco and the areas surrounding it into an area that was just terrified of this killer that came by during the night because he was such a heinous killer and he was not that predictable. The psychologists, you hear them talk about Richard Ramirez, and behavior profilers also. His behavior was much different than most serial killers because he used a multitude of weapons. It's rare, first of all, for a serial killer to use a gun because serial killers usually like that up close and personal um, style of killing with a knife or a blunt object. So that was rare in itself. A, a young detective at the time, Gil Carrillo, predicted very early on in the investigation that these were sexually related homicides. And a lot of we call them hairbags in New York City. A lot of the old time detectives were like, kid, you don't know what you're talking about, kid. And it turned out that Gil Carrillo was correct in his assessment. And what occurred after that, after the very beginning cases, was a horror for any police department, for any geographical area of people, for anyone that lived around there, even for people that didn't live there to hear what this, basically this homicidal psychotic was doing in these cases. As I said, I have two detectives tonight. The first person I'm going to ask to speak on this is Detective First Grade Michael O'Keefe. Mike, welcome to the show, and I'd like to hear your feelings about this case.
Pleasure to be here, Bill. Yeah, I actually have a lot of strong feelings about this case. I was impressed as hell with the investigation of the two top detectives, Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno, Los Angeles County Sheriff's Homicide Squad. As you said, this case occurred, this pattern, and you really kind of hard pressed to call it a pattern because he was so random in his choice of targets. There was no pattern with respect to time when he would hit. Almost no pattern as to where he would hit. Los Angeles County is huge, and he was all over the place. It seemed almost random, his selection of homes, and they were home invasion crimes for the most part. There were a handful of abductions from the street, but for the most part, most of the murders were occurring in people's homes. The other thing that you mentioned was the multitude of weapons that were used. Now, it's one of the reasons why you can say he was the perfect example of a disordered criminal, because there was no pattern. But and the other thing is he did very little to cover up the evidence of his crimes. When he was using a gun, he would repeatedly use that gun. So the ballistics were starting to match as the body count grew. He was leaving a multitude of evidence pointing to one offender. This ran from June of 1984. It actually began sooner, but the crimes that they identified and the murders were from June of 1984 through August of 1985. And for a serial murder pattern to occur, that's actually not a great deal of time. But the amount of crimes he committed from within that time frame is astonishing. It had never been seen before. And it's not just the amount of crimes, but the variety of them. There were abductions of children and sexual assaults on them. There was no rhyme or reason as to the dynamics of the victims in the homes. I mean, he attacked and raped the elderly, males, females. Just it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly, what fantasy he was trying to achieve, because most of these serial killers are trying to achieve a fantasy in their head, this murder fantasy. And this was so random and so spread out and so diverse, it's difficult to really know what was he going for, except to be an agent of chaos and make people afraid. And he was very effective at that.
Mike, some people had made comments that his eyes looked right through you. He had these angry, almost satanic eyes. And a couple of the survivors had reported that to the police. His eyes were just, basically the eyes of death.
Yeah. Well, he was a classic sociopath in that he cared about nothing but what he was going through emotionally. He didn't consider anybody else's. He didn't consider anything. He was inhuman in that regard. And you've done our job for a while. You're going to meet sociopaths, and the common aspect that I always found dealing with true sociopaths, those dead eyes, they're not looking through you. There's just nothing in them. There's nobody
there.
home.
Yeah.
There's nobody home.
The old expression,
and
the lights
that's
are
chilling
on.
in and of itself.
Yeah. The lights are on, but no one's home. That old expression, right?
Well, there's no soul. It's clearly there are things going on in their mind. It's not going to make a lot of sense to you and I or to any reasonable person, but there's just no empathy, no humanity. It's and it's frightening in its own right, just to see.
Absolutely.
So,
Mike, let me just, I want to get Irma's point of view on this, because besides the 14 murders that occurred in this crime spree, this pattern, this serial killer, there was over 30 sexual assaults. And one of them that was highlighted in the documentary was he kidnapped a 6-year-old girl out of her bed. And he actually threw her in a duffel bag and brought her into his lair. I'll call it his lair because he's an animal, and that's what animals have. They don't have homes, they have lairs. And he brought her in there and sexually abused her. And she was a smart little girl too. Like when you were watching the documentary, it just like broke your heart. The terror that she must have experienced. And then at the end of the assault, he put her back in the duffel bag, took her out, and dropped her off at a gas station and told her to call her family. What do you take from that, Irma?
First of all, he was a mixture of um, Mike said, he's a mixture of everything. Like, he was first of all, he was a burglar, he was a murderer, he was a thief. I mean, he did a kidnapper. He did so many different things before he actually started killing and raping. Because the first thing that he did was he was a burglar, and I'm pretty sure he was also did voyeurism. He probably was a masturbator.
Right.
That's how it starts a lot of times. And he is like the typical sadistic, what they call sadistic rapist. He likes to cause pain. He likes to, he likes to cause pain. He likes to torture his victims. And he also, most sadistic rapists, they kill their victims. So that's basically what he is. But he started off as a burglar. And what happened in one of the first cases that he did was when he committed his burglary, he didn't get anything from that burglary. So he killed his first victim, the 79-year-old. And then from there he started, I guess he liked the fact that he killed it. He got sexually aroused, and then he started raping, which is like, I've seen that before, where you have a rapist who starts off doing rapes of the elderly and then he winds up killing them. We had a case like that up in the 2-3 a couple of years ago before I was in sex crimes, when I was a detective in the 2-3 RIP. And I remember how he started off just doing a couple of rapes, and then he finally killed one old lady. And then from there on, it turned into a big, huge pattern, But I think on this particular case, I think he must have been a victim also of child abuse, which of course we all know his father used to tie him up and leave him in the cemetery. Imagine being a young kid being in the cemetery at night, tied up. So that was one that probably messed him up. His uncle, who kind of exposed him to, sexual pornography and explained to him what happened with him in the war. So I mean, he was like damaged. He was really damaged, as a child, and of course from there he turned into the rapist and murderer and person that he became.
Did you see any type of patterns like this in your experience in Manhattan sex crimes?
No, normally, like, a lot of the cases we had, the rapist would hit the same kind of victim. He'll either pick a woman with red hair, he'll pick a girl, Asian girl. Like we had an Asian rapist who only did little girls. And like in one particular case, the girl that he picked wasn't a little girl anymore. She was like in puberty. So he didn't want her because she already had pubic hair. So like, you have cases where they go for a specific type of victim. And in this particular case, I mean, I never seen anything where the person's going to do a child, a man, a woman, an old woman. It didn't matter what the person looked like. It didn't matter who the person was.
Right.
I mean, at first, sometimes a burglary, sometimes you might have a rapist who's an opportunist, like depending what happens, like he might just be doing a burglary, somebody's there, he decides to rape them. I mean, that's how he kind of like started, but then he became the sadistic rapist.
Yes.
Started torturing his victims.
Irma, can I just stop you for 1 second? I just want to give a shout out to some of the people on the live chat. Duty Ron, thank you so much for that super chat of $20. You're the man. MC's Audio, I saw your interview of Mark DeMeo. You're fantastic. You're going to be a superstar in this business. Spirit Seeker, These Twisted Times, David Herbsman, Mimi J2, lots of fans that are in the Duty Ron family coming to see Police Off the Cuff Real Crime Stories. And I really appreciate you guys coming by. One of the things about this case too, which I think broke your heart, was the sexual abuse and the kidnapping of young children. It was just almost too much to handle. And one of the scenes that was so heartfelt to me was when they had this little girl. She was 6 years old, and she viewed the lineup, and she looked at the lineup and she said to them, "Do you want me to write the number 2 or 2 TWO?" And all three of them were like reduced to tears, 2 detectives and the district attorney. And at that point, the district attorney said, "You know something? We're not going to prosecute these sex crimes because he's going to get life, or he's going to get the death penalty anyway. I don't want to put these kids through this." And I mean, that was the right call. I think, think of the kids, that girl, beautiful girl who's now a woman, and look, she's a beautiful woman that was kidnapped and put in a duffel bag and brought and raped and tortured, and she survived this, and now she's okay. I mean, she's okay. I'm sure she has
She didn't just she didn't just survive. She actually in the documentary she makes the point. She said, "Listen, he took me. He did these horrible things to me. He hurt me. I don't know why he let me live, but he did. And I grew up. I went to college. I got married. I have children. I have a life. I'm not letting me being a victim of this man define me.
Mhm.
I'm not going to allow him to make me what he is." And I just, if there's a hero in this apart from Gil and Frank, I'm getting a little choked up.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
she's a hero.
That's right.
And I can't say how impressed I am with this woman. She's just a superhuman being.
You know, Mike, one of the things I see, and Irma, you see it too, and we all see it, is that murder, the crime of murder, especially serial killers, has been romanticized, and people, like, they just love to hear about it and love to talk about it and love to watch TV shows about it. Irma and I were on a TV show on investigation Discovery, and Irma was called Miss Homicide. And as you know, it was a case about homicide. I did 6 episodes of The Perfect Murder, and it was not glorifying murder, but murder was the topic, you know, and people just love these shows. Look at how popular Forensic Files is. You know,
but can I say something? But that's
sure.
One problem that I noticed lately is a lot of the TV shows are showing a lot of serial killers. You know, you don't want that to start again. You know, I mean, we had serial killers, the Son of Sam. You know, we haven't seen a serial killer like in New York. I mean, except for recently, we had a serial killer in the New York City Housing Authority.
Right, I saw that.
Yeah, but
7-3.
right, but he's not the kind of serial killer like we see in Los Angeles. Like Los Angeles and some of these other cities are completely different than what we see here in New York. You know, it's just.
I think though, Irma, it's much more difficult there in 2021 for someone to become a serial killer because they get caught much quicker than they did, you know, in 1985 because of technology.
I have them. I mean, the people who were robbing cab drivers years ago and killing them, that was a serial killer. That guy, I don't think ever got caught. You know,
you're right. You're right.
Oh, I mean, those are serial killers too. If you kill a cab driver, it doesn't always have to be a serial killer. It's like the one they show on TV. That but on this particular case, is one thing that's really frightening, which I've seen happen when I was in sex crimes, is being asleep at home and having somebody come into your house in the middle of the night. I mean, I've seen it where the guys, pattern rape. We used to call them pattern rapists, not serial rapists. We used to call them patterns.
Right.
Where the family's sleeping at night, the guy comes in through the window, puts the husband on the bottom, the wife on top, commits his rape, and then leaves, But a homicide like this, I've never seen, except for there was one in the 7th precinct. The guy that came in through the window, I didn't work in that case, but he came in through the window and he actually killed 3 people in one building. And that was back in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's. I think because we're better at identifying and locking people up quicker than we were back in 1985. That
DNA helps.
We're not getting DNA and cell phones, video cameras, all that type of stuff. Go ahead, Mike. You want to say?
And it's not just the evidence of who done it. We're much better now with the use of computers.
Yes.
Of identifying these patterns early on.
See,
where
it was
difficult to do back then. These guys really had to do some legwork to figure out these other locations because it wasn't just one jurisdiction. Went to San Francisco. There were other parts of LA. There were he struck in places that were just outside LA County.
But that's why
they weren't unified. Their reporting system wasn't unified and it wasn't accessible back then. Whereas now we have that kind of accessibility. You're going to identify the pattern much quicker, and then the evidentiary stuff comes in, and you're going to identify the killer much quicker. And it's for that reason that you're going to, when you see a serial killer like this guy in the 7-3, it stopped at 3. How many would it have been if he hadn't been identified as quickly?
Right. He would have kept killing. That's for sure.
That's where VICAP comes in handy. VICAP. I don't really know what the exact meaning, what the letters mean. Anybody know?
You know, Irma, I don't think they keep that up any longer.
Yeah.
That was such a good tool.
Yeah, I
It
don't
was
think
such a
they
good
keep it up
tool.
any.
No, because other like
My
California,
experience wasn't so good with that, Irma.
right. See, but if it worked well, it would be great because like in California, for instance, all these different jurisdictions on this case, they weren't working together.
Hmm.
And that was another problem with this case. They weren't working together. One police department wasn't working with the other one. But it also becomes who's going to get him first.
Right. I just wanted to mention the first in the documentary, the first incident they list happened on March 17th, which we all know for Irish is St. Paddy's Day, right? And in that instance, he attacked a Dale Yoshi Okasaki and her roommate, and he killed the Asian girl in the house, shot her right in the head. And the roommate came in and he also shot her, but the bullet was deflected by her car keys. And she actually lived and she got a look at him. So that was the first eyeball witness they had. And that was one of the things, the weird thing about that was that as I said before, serial killers usually of his variety usually don't use a gun. They usually use a knife or a blunt object because it's the up close and personal type killing. And of course, that all reason is defied when you think of the Beltway sniper. That's all they used. And he was certainly a serial killer. And that's all he used was a gun. But in this type of home invasion, robber, sexual predator, it's rare for them to use a gun. And the first two murders, he used a 22 caliber semi-automatic, and they matched the ballistics from both those homicides. And today, we also have much better ballistics. They didn't have brass catcher back then.
Right.
You want to explain what brass catcher is, Mike?
Yeah, brass catcher. It's a database, and it's kept. It's almost like a national database of bullet characteristics, shell casings, firearms, everything having to do with ballistics. And it's characterized, it's put into this computer program, and there are points of reference, much like fingerprints. And ultimately what happens is I've got ammunition in a homicide, it's good, it's readable, there are grooves that can be read. This now goes into the system, and that bullet is now in the system, and it's characterized.
Well, Mike, one of the things, though, let me just
2 weeks later, the guy could be caught with the gun on another crime.
Right.
And when they put that into the system, it's going to spit out a match.
Right.
And now we're going to know that shooting fits this gun from this guy who was arrested. And it's another way that we can identify an offender.
But Mike, brass catcher, just for our listeners that aren't in law enforcement, what it does is it measures the tool mark on the side of the brass. And that is actually
from the injection rod.
Yes, that's actually unique to that firearm. And it spits it out of the gun, and that's left on the scene. Most of the time, the shooter does not collect his brass like we did at the range when we were shooting.
Right. Yeah.
Police up your brass, they used to say. But anyway, so those unique marks on the side of the cartridge case are very unique, and they put in like Mike said, a database, and it could be a gun could be used. Let's go back to New York City and Brooklyn, and the next week it could be used in Manhattan, and they could say, hey, that gun, that's the same gun that was used in a shooting in Brooklyn last week or a homicide. So it's a piece of evidence that's very, very important. And there's also another mark on the primer, and that's the impression that the firing pin leaves. And that's also yes, very unique to the gun. So all of these things, we've gotten better at the science of it, the forensic science of ballistics. And of course, if we can recover the actual round, and that has the lands and grooves, and it can be matched exactly to the firearm. So the first two murders, he used the same gun, and it was a 22 caliber semi-automatic. So when we talk about that in the homicide business, and I hate to act like it's a business, but that's called case linkage. And also referred to as linkage analysis. And it's a process of determining whether there's discrete connections or distinctive behavioral factors that associate two or more previously unrelated cases by means of crime scene analysis. This is very important, especially in a case like this with a serial killer. It involves establishing, comparing the physical evidence, victimology, crime scene characteristics, motivation, modus operandi, and signature behaviors of each of the cases under review. It also requires consideration of both behavioral similarities and dissimilarities. Case linkage is used in two separate and very different contexts, investigative and forensic. So all of these things, these crime scenes are so important. They're always important, but when you have a serial killer, it's up to 100%, 1,000%. This crime scene, the evidence, the scientific evidence could be on the scene to identify this guy. Mike, any thoughts on that?
Well, in this particular case, they actually used the forensics for case linkage. They were actually able to link not just the firearm, and I believe he had graduated to the 25 at this point with
Yes.
the red primer ammunition. They were able to link the ballistics or know that they were dealing with the same guy in the crimes in Los Angeles and now one in San Francisco, which is 3 hours away, a 3-hour drive away. I mean, this is a great distance for a serial killer to strike. But they were quickly able to realize it was the same guy based upon the ammunition and also based upon the distinct footprint that he left from that running shoe, that Avia, that was particular to each crime scene.
There it is right there. Up
Yeah.
on the screen is the shoe he was wearing, which was an Avia aerobic shoe. And it was found at several of the crime scenes. And one of them was found in blood on the sheet that was on the bed of the woman he had just finished murdering and raping.
And also on one of his murder and rape victims, he actually stomped on her with that shoe, and they came up with blood impressions and also impressions because he stomped on her so hard that actually came off the body. So I mean, there was a lot of anger in many of these murders and rapes.
Yeah, that it was unfortunate that someone spilled the beans about that shoe print. You know, who was it? Was it the mayor who? It
was actually Diane Feinstein. But I don't really blame her. I blame the chief that gave her that much information. There was no need to give her all that information. You could just say, look, he's identified. They have a picture of him. She didn't need to know the crime scene information, and either did the public. Because what does the guy do now? He stops wearing these shoes, right? No more case linkage, right? Because he's
they never recovered the shoes after that.
That's a really important piece of forensic evidence.
But that was also good work on the detective's part that he actually began noticing that. You know, Carrillo, is that his name, right?
Yeah,
Gil Carrillo. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, one of the third. Go ahead, Mike. You want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, the moral of the story at this point is that the greatest detriment to police investigation and police work is police administration. You got people calling the shots that are way out of their lane, and they shouldn't be permitted to even have this information, never mind give it out. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is they almost lost the Avia early on in the investigation when some ass clown tipped off the member of the press from the Los Angeles news team.
That's right. Yep.
And I am going to make a criticism about one thing with respect to, apart from Diane Feinstein, who her diarrhea of the mouth, they almost lost every secret that they had on this investigation. She shouldn't have even known any of it.
No, not at all.
But it had to be a cop or a member of the department that tipped this reporter off to the shoe. Now, okay, I understand. You're a parasite. You have a job to do, and you don't care about anybody but yourself. She actually shook the cops down to get an interview out of Gil and Frank, and they had to consent to it, or she would have blabbed about the shoe.
Absolutely.
Knowing full well that it was key evidence that had to be held back.
Yep.
She shook them down for an interview nonetheless. At the end of the documentary, they're talking about how this emotionally affected everybody involved. And they got to her, and she was so shook up because she had to experience these things. She didn't experience anything. She was a voyeur.
Mhm.
That sergeant on the screen is Sergeant Frank Salerno.
Frank Salerno.
Frank Salerno also worked on the Hillside Strangler case, so he had experience with serial killers. I'd just like to also again thank Duty Ron for another $10 super chat, and all you people that are in the chat right now. We're trying to basically not critique this case, but give also 12-Step Woman. Thank you so much for the $5 super chat. Heidi Lee, how you doing? It's Stacy, Tarot Reader. Hoppy Hoppy. I love that. I love that Hoppy Hoppy. Mimi J2. We're trying to give a little overview of this case about all the things that occurred.
Also, one thing that I like to say about this case, people have to realize how much it affected the family. I mean, even Gil's family, his family had to move out because the perp was getting so much closer to his house. So, you can see in this documentary, you can see the dynamics of how these cases actually affect law enforcement. Like, a lot of people aren't aware of that, but it really affects us just as much as it affects people who watch this documentary. Some people complain about how graphic it was, for us, like, we're so used to seeing that.
There was actually real crime scene photos in this. And I just wanted to talk about the probably one of the most heinous ones, the one on March 27th. They call it the Whittier murders. He enters Whittier, California home, previously burglarized. He fatally shoots Vincent Charles Zazzara as he's sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
And he rapes the wife, and then he kills her and cuts her eyeballs out.
Yeah, right.
And puts them in a jewelry box and takes them with him.
So crazy.
That's not a deranged homicidal maniac. I don't know what is, if that's not the behavior of it.
In a short period, he did so much in such a short period. He killed so many people.
He also left the footprint, the Avia footprint, in the flower beds, and and it was the same gun used, the same .22 caliber semi-automatic was used in this case. I don't know how much during the time of this, the actual March 14th, 1985, I don't know how much they released to the press of what he did during that case. If they released the part about him gouging out the eyes and that would probably cause sheer panic in that neighborhood.
It would have been irresponsible, I would think, to release that kind of detail to the public.
Mike, I agree with you, but police departments sometimes do that just because they want to be transparent with the press, and they don't consider the victims or maybe even the public.
It seems to me from watching this that this particular department, these two particular detectives and their direct supervisors, they played things. It looks like they played things pretty close to the vest, and they had a real good handle on what information got out and what information didn't. It was only when the pattern expanded beyond Los Angeles and they had to start sharing information with other law enforcement agencies that it all fell to hell, because now you're dealing with politics in another jurisdiction. You don't have any control at that point. And it ended up biting them in the ass when the case went to San Francisco. And the chief shared it with that imbecile mayor who's now Dianne Feinstein's a senator, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Bill, this case reminds me a little bit of Matias Reyes. Matias Reyes seems to fit this type of profile as well. He threatened to gouge the eyes out. He stabbed the mother in front of her kids. He started off just doing simple rapes, and then that's simple, but he started raping like drug, crackheads, and then he started in Central Park. So he escalated also.
Didn't he also rape his own mother?
I heard that, but I can't really.
Yeah, I think he did.
He threatened, like, one of his victims, the one that he murdered in front of her kids. He said, your eyes are your kids. He wanted to take her eyes out. So, he's the same way. Like, he was I mean, I remember him as a kid, but growing up, I remember the blank look in his eyes also, where he changed, where he just made a complete change in his personality, you know, so.
Yeah.
But
We have a question from the panel. Uh, do you feel the Netflix documented this case factually?
I don't know, because I don't know the full facts of of what happened. Only Gil and Frank, I think, can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was probably done factually. I think there were a lot of look. The documentary was probably total about 2 hours, right? And I think to cover such an extensive case in that short a period of time,
The victims are factual. The victims are factual.
yeah, I mean, I think they probably did a pretty good job. I would think that it was probably there's this is Richard Ramirez growing up with his family. I think he was actually I think he was the youngest kid in his family, so I don't think that's his sister, but I think that's
Them,
his
right?
father and his mother. Once he was cleaned up, he didn't look like the devilish person he looked like when he was out on the street.
So evil, doesn't he?
This is I'm just trying to show the little flyer for this. I'm sure a lot of you people saw this out there. And then he used to sort of taunt the press, and he thrived in showing that pentagram that he was a devil worshiper.
See, but Bill, this is another reason why the death penalty, like if they would have killed him, it would have been so easy. You know, I'm so glad that he died the way he did. I mean, he had cancer, he stayed in jail for a while. I'm pretty sure he suffered. You know, he wouldn't care if they gave him if they gave him an injection. He probably would have been very happy to take it.
Right. This is what he looked like right after he was arrested, coming off the street.
Ugh.
He was a big cocaine abuser. He was a narcotics abuser, smoked a lot of weed.
Those look like meth teeth.
Yeah, right?
Right.
That's Gil Carrillo.
Did a great
And
job.
at the time, he was a very young detective. I think he had about 11 or 12 years on the job at the time. He wound up making lieutenant.
You know, it's funny with Gil, how innocent he looked while he was working on that case. Then you see how much harder he became as he got older.
Yeah, I think he looks distinguished as he got older. But
He did a
yeah, he
great
did
job.
look like a big teddy bear.
Yeah,
He had it right.
And that's, of course, Frank Salerno.
Mhm.
I think one of the reasons why I was so drawn by these guys and so taken with them, they're from the era of the cops and detectives that when I first came on the job, that I wanted to emulate. You know, they're the Vietnam vets, the Korean War vets. They squared away. They were father figures to young cops, or you know, mentors in any event. And this was the era when they came on. It was when I was a rookie cop, and they reminded me so much of the guys in the 3-4 squad that I so wanted to grow up to be like.
Huh.
So it was this was a lot of fun for me to look into and watch.
It was a great
For that respect, and I was given to. I wanted to root for them.
You know, the other thing is, Mike, and all these major investigations, you got to remember, it's not just the detectives. There's a whole large police department, and there's people at the top that, of course, are making decisions and are getting it from the community and the politicians. Tremendous pressure when someone like this is out there. So from a patrol standpoint, I thought about that too. Like, what do you do to make sure maybe patrol catches this guy? And right away, I thought about the fact that all the crimes, he was using a stolen car.
Yeah.
He was either stealing a car for that exact purpose to commit the murders, or he was stealing a fresh car.
And they were all beaters.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So
I guess at that point you'd want to put all your patrol and your highway people on it. At nighttime, every beater on the road, pull it over, identify the driver.
Absolutely.
Verify it's not stolen.
I was thinking about that from the point of view of patrol and what could patrol do to help the detectives. How about that he was living on Skid Row at one point? How about getting undercovers out there? How about, How
Well,
about
I don't think they knew that he was living on Skid Row until they got him identified.
right? They found that out
And it was
later
one of
on.
the reasons that when you understand that, okay, this explains why there aren't witnesses that say, I think I know that guy, because it's two different universes. He's hitting in residential, middle class to well-to-do areas, but he's living in a bus terminal with bums.
Mhm.
And it's ultimately from debriefings of minor arrests of people living down on Skid Row that his identity starts to emerge, and they get an idea of who it is that they're looking for.
Mhm.
So it was, I mean, if anything else, just the
One
fact of who
thing-
he was and where he came from made it more difficult for these detectives, and they still did a brilliant job.
Right, but one thing, when you were on patrol and there was a pattern in your precinct or there was a pattern, everybody would be looking for that person at night. I'm pretty sure the cops on patrol had to be looking, based on the description they had to be doing something looking for him, because that would be a great cop, anybody.
Irma, you were in the 2-3 at that time. That 17-year-old crackhead was killing all those bodega owners. Remember that kid? I think it was in 1985.
That was McCott. Well, he didn't kill anybody. He did a lot of robberies.
But he shot a lot. He shot a lot of people.
1985. I can't remember that. I know
Yeah.
I know that Raymond Mercado was doing a lot of.
Maybe it was 86, 80. No, probably it was like 87 because I was an anti-crime. And
I was there from 82 to.
they put every anti-crime from Manhattan North in the 2-3 precinct to catch this guy. And I think street crime, along with the 2-3 anti-crime, caught the guy right after a bodega stick up.
Back then, street crime would have been all over a case like this. I mean, they were. I mean, I think on the NYPD, we did a good job. The NYPD did with pattern cases back then. Even I think today, they, like you said, I haven't heard of any patterns because I guess I'm not on the job. I don't hear too much about patterns.
But there also has to be a strategy. If he does hit, shut down the highways. A lot of times he hit close to highways because he wanted a good escape route. So that's another thing. There has to be a coordinated response, not just by the detectives, but by patrol. As soon as it goes out, all right, we think he hit again. You got to shut down the roads.
Yeah, but on a case like this, how often was it that they found out that the victims were dead right away? I mean, was it right away?
Well, a lot of times it wasn't right away.
Right,
But yeah, and that was one of the problems. Sometimes you would kill twice in one night.
I know. I can't believe he did that. I mean,
kill, and then later on, because there was no one there to rape, or he ended up killing them, he'd commit a sex crime later on in the night to take care of that aspect of his compulsion.
Right. It was
July 7th,
unbelievable.
Yeah, July 7th he did that.
Yeah, the phrase that keeps sticking in my head is agent of chaos.
Yeah.
Well, there's one, here he is, Ramirez kills in Monrovia, and I don't know California well, but these neighborhoods were spread apart. He breaks into Mabel Marbell and Florence Nettie Lang's home. He attacks Lang with a hammer, binds her in the bedroom, and then binds and attacks Bell. He uses Bell's lipstick to draw a pentagram on her body.
They were sisters, weren't they? Sisters?
Right, and on the walls of both of their bedrooms after raping her. The women are found 2 days later, alive, but Bell eventually dies from her injuries.
Yeah, July 7th.
That was the first time that Satanism was actually an element in any of the cases. That was the first time it appeared, when the pentagram showed up.
Right, when he drew the pentagram.
And
yes.
they endeavored to kind of keep that under wraps, and they were able to do so as long as the crimes continued to occur in Los Angeles. It's when it went outside and got to San Francisco that the media got tipped to the satanic aspect of it.
Right.
And I don't know if he really was a Satanist or he was just dabbling with things to see if he could fulfill the fantasy that he had in his head. The second time that Satan comes up in this is on July 7th.
He did 2 cases.
After he finishes, after he kills Sophie Dickman's husband and he rapes her and he keeps her alive. Basically, he wants to know where the valuables in the home are. And he says, "Is that it? Is that all there is?" She says, "That's all there is. I swear to God." He says, "No, don't swear to God. Swear to Satan."
That's right.
Those are the only 2 elements in these crimes, at least as far as the documentary showed, that Satanism came up.
I wonder
It brings it up again prior to the trial.
I wonder if the media made any mention of Satan, like maybe made a mention of him being satanic, maybe. I
Well,
wonder.
they did when Dianne Feinstein released it to them.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
You know,
Okay.
one of our 12-step woman, one of our live chatters asked the question, do reporters mess up your cases on a frequent basis?
Every chance they get.
Yeah, but the bosses do. The bosses give them the information. That's the problem.
See, in New York City, just the live chat folks, in New York City, we have a unit called Deputy Commissioner of Public Information. And if the press wants anything, they call that office. And then that office will either call the detective or the detective squad and ask for the information. And if the detective refuses to give it to the DCPI person, they kick it up to a DCPI boss, and he tries to intimidate you into giving the information, and information that could potentially destroy your case. But it really has gotten to the point, or when I was on the job, and Mike and Irma got to the point that they wanted to be so transparent to have a good relationship with the press that the police department didn't care if it destroyed your case.
You know who was tremendous in that position because he was a cop? Mike Collins. Do you remember him?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Alive?
Yeah, Mike's still around. I saw him at the Busick Memorial Mass when they had it last year. Looks good, but he was a detective, and you could talk when they would kick it up. When you basically tell the sergeant or the cop or the detective, no, you're not getting this information. They kick it up to him. He'd call you. You talk to him like, I'm not giving it out because of this. Yes. And Mike would be like, all right, yeah, that makes sense. Sit on that. Because he understood.
Mike, you want to hear something? I had a case of a 90-year-old Holocaust survivor was murdered by a prostitute and her boyfriend. Oof. And we had everyone in the case identified. And this morning, I get a call from a detective from DCPI. He says, oh, what's going on with the case? I said, well, we just got everyone identified and we're going out to get them right now. And he says, yeah. I go, what do you mean, yeah? He goes, let me have their names. I go, I'm not giving you their names. I go, we need to get us. He doesn't even listen to me. He hands the phone to an inspector who gets on the phone screaming, oh, no, you tell us we can't. So I immediately lied to him. I said, Chief so-and-so told me not to tell you. So since he was an inspector and this guy was a chief, he was like, you have the chief call me. Yeah, I'm sure the chief is going to
I'll get right on that.
To rush to call you, Inspector. And then we went out and got all three perps. Now you can have their names.
Yeah.
After we interviewed them, they made
statements. Would you like their photos too?
Yeah, I'll give you everything you want right now, but you weren't getting it before we got them, Yeah. But the press can be your ally, and good police departments they play the press like a violin, but
good detectives know how to play a reporter.
Yes.
I actually, in my novels, in my police novels, I have ample examples of Patty Durr twisting reporters to his own devices.
The press is very important. Look, I know, and I don't want to cut to the end of this because we're not there yet, but they used the press at the end to capture this guy. And I know, and I would have probably felt the same way that the LA detectives wanted to get him. But guess what?
And they were pretty sure that they could get him.
But you can't take that risk.
There are lives at stake.
While you're looking for him, he kills two more people.
This was the one time in the case where I actually agreed with the decision to put his identity out there.
Yes, you had to.
For the simple reason that you have to. I mean, this guy, if you look at the danger he was to the community, every little bit and the thing about it is, once you put his identity out there, they basically deputized the community. He was on every newspaper. That's how he got caught.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was another case.
I love the fact that he made the mistake of trying to run and flee through a Mexican neighborhood.
They beat him up.
They beat him up with a pipe.
With a piece of rebar. Yeah,
that was great.
It was wonderful. And it was a Chicano cop, LA sheriff, that basically he's like, I need help there. They're gonna kill us both.
They saved this killer's life, right?
Yeah, basically.
There was another case in Sierra Madre where he attacked a 16-year-old girl while she was sleeping in bed, and he hit her with a tire iron
It's crazy.
Yeah.
while she was sleeping in bed, and then tried to strangle her with a telephone cord, but the cord started to spark.
Yeah, it was an electric cord. Yeah.
Yeah,
A
and
lamp.
he flees. Ramirez flees, believing that Jesus saved this girl.
Wow.
So there it
Well, he
comes up.
thought she was dead. And then all of a sudden her eyes opened and she woke up and he thought that Jesus resurrected her. And he got all freaked out and tipped.
No, the amazing thing is, and I think about this, 85, 95, 2005, it's 46 years ago, right? Now, so that 16-year-old girl would be 62 years old right now, right? And just think of what her life's been like, having to always have that memory of, a sacred place to most people is their bed. It's
Yeah.
the safest place. It should be the safest place in the world, right? Your bed, where you go to sleep every night, where you lay your head, right? And for that to have happened to a 16-year-old girl, and she has had to live with that.
It's the ultimate violation. You have nowhere to feel safe at that point.
Was he ever interviewed and talk about why he committed his crimes? Oh, I don't think so, right? Did anyone ever?
Well,
Yeah, no, he did. He made reference to it, and basically what he came up with is he said he was evil and he wanted to cause as much fear and pain as he could, and that's exactly what he did. And I don't think there was anything about his crimes that didn't belie that fact. That's really the only motive he could have had, because he wasn't staging the crime scenes like he was trying to paint the perfect picture like a lot of serial murderers do. He's just leaving it in disarray and leaving people's lives in ruin. And I think that was in fact his motive through all of this.
Well, I watched some psychologists, and the question of, was he born this way or did he get this way from his upbringing?
I think the upbringing.
And well, there was not a consensus on how it occurred. And from all the things I watched, I think it was a combination of both. He had epilepsy,
Right.
and apparently when he was a kid, he had fallen and hit his head numerous times. He started smoking pot when he was 10 years old, and we discussed his uncle who came home from Vietnam and showed him mutilated bodies and things that he had done to these Vietnamese women. And then he also had a cousin who was a peeping Tom, and he used to take him out with him on these peeping Tom ventures. So he didn't have the most normal of childhoods, but yet there's people that have worse childhoods than that, and they don't become serial killers.
Forgetting one thing, his father used to tie him in the freaking cemetery at night. I mean, that's freaking bizarre. I mean, that alone is crazy, I mean,
no, that never happened to me. That
still not an excuse for what he did, but but
no, I'm not even saying it's an excuse, but there's people that have worse upbringings and worse things happen to them than that, and they don't become serial killers.
Yeah, I mean, that's creepy and macabre, but it's not really violence per se.
Yeah. And
The psychiatrist that examined him prior to sentencing, actually it was during an appeal for his death sentence, examined him, and he ended up writing a book about it, and he titled it Serial Killer Made, Not Born. And he cited as the cause for his mental instability, if you will, were the repeated concussions and the blackouts from being hit in the head. It cited his early drug use. It cited the uncle who basically,
he had to molest him. I'm sorry. The uncle had to do something.
yeah, that never came out, but it kind of seems like it probably occurred. Now that uncle ended up murdering his wife.
Right in front of him.
Right in front of him.
Right.
But here's the thing, and you don't know this until you do some follow-up reading. He beat that case on an insanity charge, and he was back in Ramirez's life 3 years later, just 3 years after this murder. So he was like a professor emeritus of serial crime.
He sees his uncle get away with murder. He probably thinks he get away with it too.
Yeah.
Mike, was it his cousin or his uncle that was in Vietnam? I'm a little.
It was
confused.
the uncle.
It was the uncle. Okay,
Miguel,
so
yeah. And
Duty,
Miguel actually, he was in special forces, as a matter of fact, in Vietnam, and he had pictures of mutilations of Vietnamese women that he had raped and tortured and not even disfigured, dismembered. One of them, including, he had the woman's head in the photo.
It's crazy.
So it was as if, if you could build a serial murderer, I guess this is probably graduate school. I guess, I don't know.
I want to shout out again to Duty Ron. He keeps throwing me money. Duty Ron, I feel like I'm a pole dancer. Thank you so much for that $5 chat. And Kathy Drew, hello, 12-Step Woman, Moonlight View. Marlene Lakios, These Twisted Times, Rebecca Hicks, Jacqueline Gutierrez, Mimi J2, Duty Ron, of course, MC's Audio. It's Stacy, Kathy Drew, Michelina Sereno. All you people at your Duty Ron fans that are coming on to the Police Off the Cuff Real Crime Stories podcast, I'm happy that you're subscribing to my channel. As you could see, these superstars that I bring in all the time from the NYPD, Detective Michael O'Keefe, both first graders, Detective Irma Rivera, Miss Homicide, Miss Lower East Side, Miss Alphabet City, whatever you want to call it. Isn't she beautiful?
Yeah, right.
I won't even say how old she is, because Latino women don't age.
Can I say one thing about, like you keep mentioning that I'm a first grader. Richard Price was a writer, who's a friend of mine. He sent me an article regarding the first female first grade detective who I want to give a shout out to. Her name was Isabella Goodwin. She was born in 1865. She became a cop in like 1912, and she got first grade she was the first woman to get first grade in the NYPD, because she worked on a robbery case where she became an undercover. So to her family, if they're out there, Isabella Goodwin, I just want to, she laid the groundwork for me.
That's a beautiful shout out. And for you folks from other states, other cities, other countries, a first grade detective on the NYPD makes lieutenant's pay. So he gets to do all the cool work, the investigative work, and he doesn't have to be a boss or sit on the desk or any of that stuff. And most first grade detectives, besides making lieutenant's pay, they usually make about 500 or 600 hours a year overtime. So they're living large, right?
Yeah, but besides being a first grade woman detective, she also became a first grade lieutenant, and she died in 1943. So Isabella Goodwin, a shout out to her.
A shout out to her family, because I'm sure she's not around anymore. But
Richard Price, thank you for the article.
That's great. That's excellent. So on this case, one of the things that threw everyone off, of course, is how prolific he was, and the different behaviors he exhibited at the crime scenes, and the different behaviors he exhibited by doing the gamut of crimes that he did. Burglaries, the sex crimes of kids was just over the top. And that's the thing, I think, that all the behaviorists, all the detectives, anyone that investigated this case, that was the thing, I think, that really, they got everyone, that this guy was not just a serial killer, but he was a serial sex offender of children. And that would, anyone that hurts children is the devil, is no good. He's just.
Well, interestingly enough, I actually have a point. I was thinking about that, and with the exception of an early abduction and murder of a child, for the most part, his child victims, he did not kill.
Except for one, the first one.
The first one, yeah. But after that, and it began with Anna Horonis. He would abduct them. He would take them, if not at the location, he would take them somewhere else, and he would brutalize them sexually. But other than that, he wasn't using any other violence on them, and he would leave them somewhere and have them contact family to come get them. Now, in his mind, I believe he thought that he wasn't hurting them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason why he treated children differently than his adult victims in most cases is because intellectually and emotionally, he related to them and thought of himself as a child, as a petulant child that was just satisfying his whims.
Or he was molested as a child also, which could have happened also with him, and that could have been the reason why. You know, I mean,
it's entirely possible. But
and the first one he killed, you know, maybe he felt bad about killing that one person. Or it could be another thing where I've seen perps, you know, where they'll scar a victim. I mean, that he want to scar them forever. Like, you know, it could be another.
Well, the only semblance of empathy he shows throughout this horrendous victimization of society with violence is leaving the child sex victims alive. And that's it. That's the single element of humanity he demonstrates. And it almost seems in the conversations Anna shares, their conversation, he actually apologizes and says, I'm sorry. But he says, but I'm not sorry because I'm not going to stop. So it's
well, you know, it's the common thing that the abused becomes the abuser,
right?
And he probably was sexually abused as a child.
A lot of the perps that I arrested in sex crimes, a lot of them were molested as children. You know, a lot of them were. As a matter of fact, like I've mentioned once before, the East Side rapist, you know, one of the East Side rapists, he had a big scar across his mouth. And he told me that he tried to commit suicide when he was younger, biting into a cord. And I said to him, I go, you know, were you molested as a child? And he says, I remember his words. He said, I know what it feels like to rape, and I know what it feels like to be raped. And he tried to commit suicide as a kid, biting into a cord. I think it was his grandfather was molesting him, because I asked him that, but he didn't want to answer that question. That was a brownstone rapist, actually.
Yeah.
He's climbing through the windows at night.
The interesting thing about that, Irma, is a lot of offenders were victims in the past, but the flip side of that coin, and you seldom see it spoken about, there are people who have grown up as victims of abuse and violence and sexual violence, and it triggers a protective instinct in them. And they become vigilant, and many of them become police officers for that reason. Because
who molested them? A priest, or was it somebody else? You know, was it a stranger?
It really doesn't matter. I mean, I haven't seen extensive studies on it, but I've read some things on it that not everybody who is a victim of this type of violence necessarily becomes an offender.
No,
sometimes it's the flip side of the coin, and they become the protectors.
Right.
So it's an interesting dichotomy. This guy could have gone both ways.
One other question, Mike. The book, who's the person who interviewed him that you said earlier? She wrote a book about it?
No, it was a he, actually. I think it was the psychiatrist that interviewed him, I believe, during one of his appeal processes for the death penalty.
What's the name of the book? Do you have the name of the book, or you don't know?
I think if you look it up, it's is it Serial Killer Made Not Born?
Okay, all right.
Okay, you probably, if you Google that, it'll come up. I know it was in one of the articles that I read on this case, and it was information that wasn't contained in the documentary. One other thing that was absent from the documentary, and I'm sure it was just because the documentarians never got to it, there was no mention of photo books or victims looking at photos. Which is interesting, because you would think that would be one of the first things that you would do. Now, keep in mind, this was in the days of WETs. Nobody has a computerized system.
Remember back then?
Remember Catch?
Yeah. Now you can catch even the old MO
you burn your witnesses out looking at too many pictures sometimes.
How about the MO room? You guys familiar with the MO rooms? I mean, I came out in 1982, but that was the MO room. Do you remember that? Or you guys are not familiar with the MO room? There was a room downtown where they used to have all the pictures. Just, it was called an MO room, and everything was by MO of the crime.
That's actually when at the time my first assignment in the detective bureau was in Queens, and they called it Catch, and it was the same thing. The pictures were broken down by crime.
No, Catch was different. The Catch came later. There was another room down in headquarters. It was in the fingerprint room, in the fingerprint unit, latent fingerprint unit, where they had all the pictures there. This is before Catch, and then I remember when Catch came later on.
You're dating yourself, Irma. That was before my time.
I know, it was 1982 when I came on. So
You know, Irma was 20 years old when she came on the police department. Can you imagine that?
You just gave her age away.
It's
Thanks,
okay.
Bill.
Oh, well,
it's all right.
well, she looks beautiful. I mean, I won't tell you how old she is, but you know, one of the things I wanted to mention, and this case was not listed in the documentary, and April 10th, 1984, Ramirez worked in the Holiday Inn, and he kidnapped, raped, and murdered a 9-year-old Chinese girl.
Yeah.
And the thing, when you talk about technology, they didn't link this case to him until 2009 because of DNA.
And because of the detective who had a cold case.
Yes, a cold case. But one of the things that
And wasn't Ramirez already dead by then?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I'm sure of, and I would love to talk to Gil Carrillo, if I sent him to our fans, I sent Gil Carrillo I friended him on Facebook, and we're friends on Facebook, and I invited him to come on this show. I don't know if he will, and I also sent him a invitation to watch tonight's show, and I'm sure he must get tons of invitations. But hey, we're brothers in blue. You know, you can come on, Gil, if you're watching this, right? I'm not a journalist.
He's
We're
a
brothers.
star now, and justifiably so.
Yeah, he is. He's a big star.
And he
after
deserves
this.
every bit of it.
And he was, well, he
adulation.
was a star when this happened. And he,
Yeah.
just to follow up, Gil Carrillo did 38 years on the job.
Oh.
And he retired as a lieutenant. And he actually was a police chief, an acting police chief for about 4 months.
For him.
But you know, in California, you know how they are down there. They, after 4 months, they didn't like him, you know. And he was a superstar, you know. But when we talk about also the serial killer, I'm sure he did tons more crimes than he was ever caught for.
Right.
And including, I'm sure there's other murders he did that were never linked to him. What do you think about that, Mike?
Absolutely. I mean, he was his headquarters was basically the bus terminal, and we know he was traveling obviously between San Francisco and Los Angeles. His family was still in
Texas, El Paso, Texas, yeah.
And he had also family in Arizona. So, I mean, there's a lot of real estate between all of those points. And if you look at his frequency of attacking, anywhere that there's a lull in Los Angeles and San Francisco, it's a good bet he was doing crime somewhere else.
Absolutely.
That was the one thing that if you look at it, you take out those gaps of offending and just look at and put the time together when he was in one location, he just was so consistent. Pretty much it was like a vitamin for him, one a day.
Yeah.
And in many cases, 2 times a day.
Yeah.
So for there to be crimes out there that we don't know about that he participated in, it's very, very possible.
How old was he when he was around? How old was he when he did this?
I think he was 28.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
The other thing is, a lot of people may ask, what did he do for a living? Did he ever have a job?
He had 2 jobs.
Go ahead, Mike.
The first was when he was before he had dropped out of school. He worked in a Holiday Inn in El Paso, and he was arrested for trying to forcibly rape one of the people in the hotel.
That's right.
The husband came home, gave him a savage beating, and held him for the police. And he was arrested, but they ended up having to dismiss the case because the family was not coming back to testify.
Wow.
I guess the husband got enough of. He gave him a good enough beating. He didn't want to.
Well, they didn't want to go back to El Paso for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And there was reference to another crime that he committed that he was arrested for burglarizing hotel rooms in a hotel that he worked at when he had relocated to Los Angeles. So those were the only 2 legitimate employment that's ever mentioned in his background. And what he was a thief.
Yes. Yeah.
He stole everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was the other aspect of these murders. Usually a serial murder, he's there for the violence. This guy stole things and was living on the proceeds of these these robberies.
You know, Mike, what I would be interested in, and I'm sure they didn't cover this in the documentary because it's not sexy or interesting maybe to the viewers, but I would have been interested to know where he fenced the stuff that he stole from these crime scenes
Right.
and these murder scenes, because that would have definitely been a way to identify him maybe
And I'm
earlier.
sure they pursued those leads, but the fact that nothing came up and that they mentioned in the documentary. I worked burglaries in the 83rd precinct in Bushwick for a couple of years, and what I discovered is the best burglars, the ones that lasted the longest before I caught them, were selling their swag to people on the street. They weren't going near pawn shops.
Right.
He did.
Because that's how I was getting them, off of the property.
Right. Probably in Skid Row. He probably sold it to people at Skid Row.
Well, that's just, and the other thing, he's in the bus terminal, so it's transient people coming and going.
You know, Mike,
Commuters.
I would have thought exactly like you thought, but I remember I was working in the 2-3. I was in the squad in the 2-3, and a guy did a violent rape in one of the housing projects, and he took a medallion off this girl that was really identifiable, and she had had it her whole life. He went right to the pawn shop on 103rd Street and 3rd Avenue and pawned it. Special victims, as part of their investigative checklist, went right to the pawn shop, and guess what the idiot had to supply to get? Picture ID. They just went right to his house. Guess where you're going? You're going to Coxsackie for 15, you know?
Yeah.
I was amazed that the guy did that, you know? He did a violent crime, took property, a robbery, rape, and then took it to a pawn shop and gave photo ID. I mean, so it does happen. These guys are not rocket scientists. That's why they're doing crimes, you know?
Yeah. Well, you know what? If he had half a brain in his head, he'd be doing something for a living other than hurting people.
Well, for sure.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of these crime scenes also, folks that are watching this right now, if you haven't watched the documentary, The Night Stalker, another thing he did that would get him caught today is that after doing his murders or rapes, he would sit down and eat the food.
Right.
People's refrigerator right at the table. Today, if a criminal did that, he would leave his DNA, saliva, you know, on a can or on an apple or whatever he was eating. And that would get the person caught. But back then, there was no, you know, again, 1985, DNA didn't exist yet, at least the processing of DNA.
There was a criminal case when it was first, the history of DNA being used in criminal cases was actually on a pattern sex crime murder in England, in central England. And what it is, it was all centralized into the one village. And when they realized, okay, he's leaving bits of himself at the scene, they actually went out and tested every male in the village, 14,000 samples.
Wow.
And they had obviously the victims tests, you know, that the samples recovered from the crime scene. And the guy actually ducked being found out early on. He got someone else to supply the DNA for him. And then the family member realized, oh, okay, that's why he didn't want to give it. And then they went and got him, and they got his DNA, and they had him identified, and they took care of it. And it's actually, I read the book.
What year was that?
I want to say that was like 1983.
And where was that at? What state?
It was in England.
Oh, in England.
But there is source material for this in minute detail. Joseph Wamba, who, apart from writing his brilliant police novels, also did true crime books. And this was one of his. I don't remember the title of it, but it was one of his books. And it was the first time DNA was used as a criminal identifier.
Well, do you know in Manhattan, or actually New York City, the first case of a DNA identifier was in the 2-3 precinct, a serial killer named Aaron Key.
Nice.
I remember that case.
That was the
that?
first, 1997.
Yeah.
That was the first time DNA linked cases together.
Was he a rapist also? Or
He was a
no?
rapist also. Yes, he was a
Well,
serial.
the science was there, but it wasn't utilized. And even if it's utilized, if you don't have a database to compare it to, you don't really have a lot to go on.
It's so advanced now. You can make
Well,
Now,
It got-
yeah, and well, now there are national databases.
It
Everything is
also got
cross-referenced.
advanced through the World Trade Center attacks.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
they-
now it's so advanced, you can actually make a face of what the person might look like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And there's different types. They used to have the RFLP, which is restriction fragment length polymorphism. Then there was something called short tandem repeats. Now they have a thing called polymerase chain reaction, where they can take a very small amount of DNA and replicate it, make it larger, and that's how they can make the identification. So
Yeah.
on the World Trade Center, because they had so much DNA and they had to identify people from very small parts of their anatomy, a little piece of bone or a
Mhm.
tooth.
Well, that
And
was
they
that
had
was
to-
the other aspect. There's a lot of the bones that were being recovered. There was no way to actually recover DNA from them yet.
Right.
They continue to work on it experimentally to the point now. Just like you said, they come up with the tiniest little bit of tissue, and it could be dried bone marrow on the inside of the bone, and they're able to expand it and come up with a full DNA chain.
A few,
It's really
yeah,
amazing.
a
Yeah.
full profile. That's absolutely
Yeah,
correct.
yeah.
You know, and a lot of people get frustrated even about the Gilgo Beach murders.
Mhm.
But those bodies, for the most part, weren't recovered for over a year. So they were out in the elements for a year. So no DNA was, as far as I know, was ever recovered. So to link those cases to a perpetrator is, it's pretty damn difficult. Unless they have something that I don't know about, that they have in a genealogical database or something. I don't believe they have DNA on the Gilgo Beach cases.
Now, decomposed bodies, like I mean, I've seen on other cases where, the person's so decomposed, you can't get any DNA from them. I mean, there's nothing. There's
I
nothing.
think it's coming to the point that if there's a bone left, they're going to get it.
No, for the perpetrator, I'm talking about. For the perpetrator,
Right.
you know?
Right. Yeah. The surface DNA,
Mhm.
it probably won't survive under those circumstances. Well,
Like,
particularly in the Gilgo Beach case, you're talking about they're exposed to salt water.
Right.
I mean, salt water dissolves organic material. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
But you think of a case like this, and this was 1985, and you think that if this case happened today, it wouldn't have lasted. I mean, the perpetrator would have been ID'd much quicker.
Standing back and looking at this investigation and understanding the limitations of the evidence to these detectives, you look at the fact of how quickly, I mean, they were lightning fast, given the limitations and the obstacles they had to overcome. If you look at it in today's detective's perspective of what constitutes evidence and what's available to look at now, it's not fair. It's a different world entirely. What they were
Absolutely.
dealing with was old school. It's what they used to call a shoe leather detective. They were
Yeah,
wearing their shoes out.
You got a gumshoe. You got to get.
Yep.
You got to
Yeah,
get
gotta
out
get
in
the
the
gumshoes.
the gumshoe. You got to get out on the street.
Yeah.
You got to talk to people. You got to go where the criminal's going. You got to go into that element and talk to people.
But aren't you glad you were a detective at that point when we were doing that? I used to love going onto the street and interviewing people and getting information that way. That's like
Irma,
the-
you know something? I always said that the number one way we solved cases was talking to people.
Of course, the public.
And we would love when we got a fingerprint hit or we got DNA or some type of forensic evidence. We'd be like, oh, that's great. That happens once in a while.
Yeah.
But we didn't depend on it.
What
we depended on was the great work of the detectives.
Like back then, I remember looking at old homicide cases and the person was convicted being O positive blood type. I mean, like you said earlier, half the population is O positive blood type.
Right.
I saw cases like that in the early 80s. There were old cases. The person was arrested, O positive blood type. They used to do the blood typing.
Yeah.
And
I cleared a bunch of
positive.
I cleared a bunch of old murders in the 8-3 when they redid the inside of the squad. the closet in the back with the old homicides. We had to take all of that stuff out. So now I start looking through the old homicide cases, and you see cases where the detectives knew who the perp was. And you look at the crime scene, you look at what was vouchered, and there's stuff there that that's DNA. On several of them, and my wife hated me for this because she worked in the property clerk and they handled the old DOA barrels. I had her bring down the barrel, knock the lid off to go get that evidence to bring it to the medical examiner's office. And occasionally we're fortunate. The perp might be dead, but he ended up taking a pinch in Florida and they took his DNA because his last collar was late enough. I think 4 cases I got DNA hits like that, and I was able to, and for what it's worth, I was able to take exceptional clearances.
That's great.
But finally, my lieutenant's like, you're spending a lot of time and a lot of money, but you got no living perps. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to give this a rest now.
But what it is though, like even like that night, the girl that was killed by Ramirez. I mean, for so many years, the family is wondering who killed your family members. It puts closure on people just to know who did it.
Absolutely.
And I got some cases that I still think about that we never closed.
Yeah.
They wonder who did them.
I just wanted to mention one last thing before we close the top to this case. There was a couple of mistakes made, and in every major homicide investigation, there's mistakes. We're human beings. We make mistakes. I would always think about that sometimes when the case was over and you critique yourself and you look at, you self-criticize. And I'd be like, wow, I should have known that, or I should have did this, or I should have did that. And one of the big mistakes on this case was that he was in a stolen car and another police jurisdiction vouched the car. And they told the detectives from LA that they were going to dust it for prints. Instead, they left it out in the sun for months and never dusted it for fingerprints. So we all know that fingerprints are liquid. If the liquid in the fingerprints melts because it's made from oil from your skin, and if that evaporates, there's no more fingerprints, So after maybe 5 or 6 months, they went back to this car and they actually did get a big piece of evidence that helped them get him identified. And another stolen car, they recovered a fingerprint from the mirror. You know how you always touch the mirror in your car, the rear view mirror? And they also, when you talk about technology, they didn't have AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system. So they had to match up the fingerprint by eye, manually. So, just think of how difficult that was. But I was just going to mention, that was a big mistake. And everyone makes mistakes, I'll put it that way. And I'd imagine Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno were just every day working 16, 18-hour tours. Yeah. They couldn't think of every possible thing,
No, they had to be exhausted and emotionally spent at the same time, because obviously this case is very personal to them. But interestingly enough, at the old-fashioned way that we used to get print hits, from interviewing people, they finally came up with the name Richard Ramirez, but that's really all they had. Then they got the latent fingerprint off the mirror.
Yes.
They went through the state of California, and there were, I believe, 8 Richard Ramirez's that were approximately the right age, race, whatever. And through manually examining all 8 of those, they came up with the right one, and that's how he was ultimately identified.
Yeah, but they could have had him before with the
Amazing.
They could have had him before with the car from the dentist, but then remember the boss took them off the.
That was another big mistake. I wasn't going to tell him about that one.
The bean counters.
Yeah. They
a day of overtime for those.
We don't want to ruin it for the people that haven't watched the documentary yet, but that was another mistake. Yeah. Guys, we've been going for an hour and 25 minutes, and I think it's about time we wrap this up. What I wanted when I wanted to do this case, I didn't want to say critique it. I just wanted to talk about it because it's a very interesting case, and to talk about it from the perspective of people that have investigated homicides and investigated serial crimes. and have investigated sex crimes and investigated psychopathic killers. And I think that it's good for the audience out there to hear our opinions and hear how police work is done. But I would just like, in closing, really take my hat off to the Los Angeles detectives Gil Carrillo and Sergeant Frank Salerno. You make us proud to be in this profession.
Yeah.
Right? Mike, you got any last words? You want to plug anything before you say goodbye?
No, just if murder's your bag, and you like all the emotion and the drama that goes with it, check out my novels at michaelokeefeauthor.com and Amazon. All of my novels are basically based on real cases, and some of you guys that worked in Brooklyn North, you're going to recognize some of them. You might even recognize yourself.
That's great, Mike. Irma, you got any?
Isabella Goodwin, thank you for being the first grade female detective, and thank you for setting the path for me. But everybody else should stay safe and watch that COVID, wash your hands, and make sure you watch Night Stalker.
Irma, you're the best. You're not going to plug your private eye business?
No, I don't.
Okay. She's got enough.
I work with Sage Intelligence Group, and I also work for myself.
Well, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I hope you guys out there enjoyed this. I'm Bill Cannon from Police Off the Cuff. If you like this channel, please subscribe. If you want to become a Patreon customer of ours, it's www.patreon.com/policeoffthecuff. We have 3 tiers. For $7 a month, you get to be the bucket. For $9 a month, you get to polish my rack. And for the premier tier, for $11 a month, you get to dip them in butter. I won't tell you what you get to dip in butter, but that's what you get to do. Anyway, I'm Bill Cannon from Police Off the Cuff. Real crime stories. Stay safe, and thank you for watching.
Thank you. Bye.